The dust kicked up from the town square hung in the air like a shroud of shame, settling on the shoulders of everyone who had gathered to witness what no decent person should ever have to see. Martha Henley stood on the makeshift platform, her 3 children clinging to her worn calico dress, their faces streaked with tears and confusion. The eldest, Thomas, barely 14, tried to stand tall like his father had taught him, but his lower lip trembled with the effort. Little Sarah, only 6, buried her face against her mother's hip, while 10-year-old Michael kept looking around as if expecting someone to tell him this was all a terrible mistake. The auctioneer, a greasy man named Cornelius Blackwood who had rode into Redemption Falls just that morning, adjusted his spectacles and cleared his throat. His voice carried across the square with practiced authority, though it made the bile rise in the throats of those forced to listen. The debt, he announced, was substantial. $372, accumulated over the past 2 years since Jacob Henley had taken ill and could no longer work his small plot of land outside town. Medical bills, unpaid store credit, borrowed seed money that never yielded the promised harvest. The numbers rolled off Blackwood's tongue like a death sentence. Martha's hands shook as she held her children closer. She had known this day might come, had seen the way the townspeople looked at her with pity mixed with fear, as if poverty might be contagious. But knowing and experiencing were 2 different kinds of hell entirely. The morning sun beat down mercilessly on the wooden platform, and she could feel the weight of every stare, every whispered judgment from the crowd below. Her husband Jacob had been a good man, a hard-working farmer who had loved his family more than life itself. He had fought the fever for months, refusing to give up even when the doctor said there was no hope. When death finally claimed him, it had taken not just her beloved husband, but their future, their security, everything they had built together. The town banker, Harold Grimsby, stood off to the side with his arms crossed, his face a mask of cold satisfaction. He had been the one to call in the debt, the one who had suggested this barbaric solution when Martha couldn't scrape together even $50 toward what she owed. Indentured servitude, he called it, as if giving it a fancy name made it any less than slavery. The highest bidder would own Martha and her children for 7 years, long enough to work off the debt with interest. 7 years of their lives, sold like cattle at market. 7 years during which they would have no rights, no freedom, no guarantee of even basic human dignity. Sheriff Coleman shifted uncomfortably near the platform steps, his badge catching the sunlight. He was a good man caught in an impossible situation, bound by laws that seemed designed more for ledger books than human hearts. He had tried to find another way, had even approached some of the wealthier ranchers privately. But legal debt was legal debt, and the territorial judge had signed the papers himself. The law was clear, even if it was heartless. Martha could see the shame in his eyes, the way he couldn't quite bring himself to look directly at her and the children. The crowd murmured uneasily as Blackwood began his pitch. A strong woman, he declared, experienced in farm work and child rearing. 3 children who could earn their keep with proper guidance. The oldest boy nearly grown, perfect for heavy labor. A bargain for any man looking to expand his household or needing extra hands. His words turned Martha's stomach, reducing her family to nothing more than livestock to be appraised and purchased. She thought of the auction block in the slave markets she had heard about, and realized with horror that this was not so different. Among the gathered townsfolk stood several men who had already made their intentions clear. Silas Morganton, who owned the largest saloon in 3 counties, had been eyeing Martha with a hunger that had nothing to do with labor. His reputation with women was well known, and the thought of what he might demand from her made Martha's blood run cold. He had already approached her twice since Jacob's death, making offers that had nothing to do with honest work and everything to do with satisfying his own base desires. The cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth told her that he saw this auction as his chance to finally possess what he had been pursuing. Then there was Isaiah Polk, whose ranch hands whispered about the way he treated his workers, about men who had signed on and never been seen again. The cruel smile playing at the corners of his mouth as he looked at her children made Martha want to gather them up and run. Consequences be damned. She had heard the stories about Polk's ranch, about workers who had tried to leave and been found days later with mysterious injuries, about wages that were never paid and debts that somehow grew larger instead of smaller. The thought of her children under his control was worse than any nightmare she had ever imagined. But running would only make things worse. There was nowhere to go. No family to take them in, no friend wealthy enough to pay their debt. Martha's parents had died years ago, and Jacob's family had never approved of their marriage. She had already sold everything of value they owned, down to her wedding ring and Jacob's pocket watch. This moment, standing on this platform like a criminal awaiting execution, was the end of a long road of desperate choices and dwindling options. Every door had been closed to her, every avenue of escape blocked by the cruel mathematics of poverty and debt. The bidding began at $50, and Martha closed her eyes as the numbers climbed. Morganton's voice rang out confidently, countered immediately by Polk's gravelly drawl. Other voices joined in, men she barely knew treating her family's future like a game of cards. Thomas squeezed her hand, and she opened her eyes to see him watching the crowd with a mixture of fear and rage that belonged to no 14-year-old boy. In his young face, she could see echoes of his father, the same stubborn pride that had kept Jacob fighting even when the fever was consuming him. At the edge of the square, barely visible in the shadow of the general store, stood a figure that most folks in Redemption Falls had noticed, but few had ever heard speak. Cain Morrison was a rancher who lived in the high country, running cattle on land that most considered too harsh and remote for civilized living. He came to town maybe once a month for supplies, paid his bills in cash, and minded his own business with a dedication that bordered on religious. Tall and lean, with prematurely gray hair and eyes the color of winter storms, he had the look of a man who had seen too much of the world's cruelty and had retreated to a place where silence was safer than words. Cain had been watching the proceedings with an expression that revealed nothing of his thoughts. To most observers, he appeared merely curious, another townsperson drawn by the spectacle of human misery that seemed to fascinate people in the same way that folks slowed down to stare at accidents on the road. But those who looked more closely might have noticed the way his hands had slowly formed fists at his sides, the slight tightening around his eyes that suggested emotions held carefully in check. Martha had seen him before, of course, had nodded politely when their paths crossed at the mercantile or the post office. He had always tipped his hat respectfully, but they had never exchanged more than basic pleasantries. She knew nothing about his personal life, his past, or what had driven him to choose such an isolated existence. Now, as the bidding climbed past $100, she found herself looking toward that shadowy figure with something approaching desperation. Not because she expected him to intervene, but because his stillness seemed like the only solid thing in a world that was spinning out of control. Morganton's bid of $125 hung in the air like a curse. The saloon owner was practically licking his lips as he stared at Martha, and she felt her children press closer against her. She could imagine the life that awaited them under his ownership, the degradation and abuse that would be their daily reality. Polk countered with 130, his cold eyes calculating exactly how much labor he could extract from 4 people over 7 years. The other bidders began to fall away, unable or unwilling to match the stakes these 2 men were willing to pay for human misery. Sarah began to cry again, her small voice breaking the tension like glass shattering. "Mama, I'm scared," she whispered, and Martha felt her own composure beginning to crack. She had tried so hard to be strong for her children, to face this ordeal with dignity, but the sound of her youngest daughter's fear was more than she could bear. Tears began to stream down her face as she realized that in moments, her family would be torn apart and scattered to whatever fate awaited them. That's when Cain Morrison stepped forward. His boots made no sound on the packed earth, but somehow the crowd seemed to sense his movement. Conversations died away as people turned to look at the silent rancher, many of them surprised to realize he had been there at all. He walked with the measured pace of a man who never hurried, never wasted motion, never spoke unless the words served a purpose. There was something in his bearing that commanded attention, a quiet authority that made even the most boisterous men fall silent. When he reached the front of the crowd, he stopped and looked up at Martha for a long moment. His gray eyes held hers, and she saw something in them that she hadn't expected. Not pity, not hunger, not calculation. Something that looked almost like recognition, as if he understood exactly what she was feeling in that moment, because he had felt it himself. There was pain in those eyes, old and deep and carefully hidden, but also something else. Something that might have been resolve. Then he turned to face Blackwood, and when he spoke, his voice carried clearly across the square despite its quiet tone. $500. The silence that followed was complete. Even the children stopped crying, as if the universe itself had paused to absorb the shock of the moment. $500 was more money than most folks in Redemption Falls saw in 2 years. It was enough to buy a small ranch, or a year's worth of supplies, or passage to California for an entire family. It was an amount that spoke of serious wealth, the kind of money that most people could only dream of possessing. Blackwood's jaw worked soundlessly for several seconds before he managed to find his voice. Did you say $500, sir? His hands were actually shaking as he adjusted his spectacles, unable to believe what he had heard. Cain nodded once, his expression unchanged. Cash. He reached into his coat and produced a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of gold coins. Real money, not promises or IOUs or fancy papers from distant banks. Morganton sputtered indignantly, his face flushing red with anger and embarrassment. Now wait just a minute. This isn't some charity auction. I was bidding on that woman and her children fair and square. His voice cracked with outrage, but underneath Martha could hear something else. Fear. He was afraid of Cain Morrison, and that fear was making him desperate. Cain's head turned slowly toward the saloon owner, and whatever Morganton saw in those winter, storm eyes made him take an involuntary step backward. The temperature in the square seemed to drop 10 degrees as Cain fixed his gaze on the man who had been planning to purchase Martha for his own twisted purposes. You want to bid $600. The challenge hung in the air like a blade. Morganton's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on dry land, but no words came out. $500 was already more than he could reasonably afford, and everyone in the square knew it. $600 might as well have been $6,000. He was a successful businessman, but his wealth came from whiskey and gambling, not the kind of solid prosperity that could support such an astronomical bid. Polk cleared his throat and spat into the dust, his face twisted with frustration and greed. Hell, Morrison, what you want with a widow and 3 brats anyway? You live up in that godforsaken canyon like some kind of hermit. Ain't natural for a man to be alone so long. Maybe you got ideas about that woman same as the rest of us. There was an ugly insinuation in his words, a suggestion that Cain's motives were no purer than his own. Cain's gaze shifted to Polk, and the temperature in the square seemed to drop another 10 degrees. When he spoke, his voice was quiet as winter wind through bare trees, but it carried a menace that made strong men shiver. My reasons are my own, Polk, you bidding or not. There was something in Cain's tone that suggested this was not a man to be trifled with, that beneath his quiet exterior lay depths of danger that most folks couldn't begin to imagine. Polk glared back for a moment, his pride warring with his survival instincts, then shook his head. Too rich for my blood, but don't come crying to me when you realize what you've bought yourself. Blackwood looked around the crowd hopefully, his greedy eyes searching for any other potential bidders. $500 would earn him a substantial commission, but $600 or $700 would make him rich by his standards. But no other voices rose to continue the bidding. $500 was simply beyond the reach of anyone else present, and even those who might have scraped together such a sum were beginning to question the wisdom of opposing Cain Morrison. There were stories about the silent rancher, whispered tales of what had happened to the last men who had tried to push him too far. Most folks figured those stories were probably exaggerated, but nobody seemed eager to test the theory. The auctioneer cleared his throat and raised his gavel, his voice trembling slightly with excitement and disbelief. $500 going once, going twice. He paused, sweeping his gaze across the crowd one final time, giving anyone with deep pockets and deeper foolishness one last chance to enter the bidding. When no one spoke, he brought the gavel down with a sharp crack that seemed to echo off the surrounding buildings. Sold to Cain Morrison for $500. The sound of the gavel hitting the wooden block seemed to echo forever in Martha's ears. She looked down at Cain, this stranger who had just purchased her family's freedom with more money than she had ever dreamed of possessing. He was reaching into his coat pocket, pulling out the leather pouch that clinked with the weight of gold coins. Real money, not promises or IOUs or fancy papers from distant banks. As Blackwood counted out the payment with greedy fingers, Martha tried to understand what had just happened to her life. As the auctioneer verified the payment and completed the legal paperwork, Cain climbed the steps to the platform. Up close, Martha could see the lines around his eyes, the scars on his hands, the careful way he moved that spoke of old injuries never quite healed. He was older than she had thought, probably in his late 30s, with the weathered look of a man who had spent his life working under the open sky. There was strength in his frame, but also a wariness that spoke of burdens carried too long alone. He stopped in front of her and touched the brim of his hat in a gesture of old-fashioned courtesy. "Mom," he said quietly, his voice gentle despite its obvious strength. "If you and your children would gather your things, I'll take you home." Martha stared at him, trying to understand what had just happened, trying to process the fact that her family's fate had just been decided by a man she barely knew. "Home," she managed to whisper, the word feeling strange on her tongue. She had thought she would never have a home again. Cain nodded toward the mountains that rose beyond the town like sleeping giants, their peaks still touched with snow despite the warmth of early summer. "My ranch. It's not much, but there's room enough and plenty of work for willing hands." His tone was matter of fact, as if he had just offered to help her carry groceries rather than completely changed the course of her family's life. Thomas stepped forward, his young voice cracking with emotion and suspicion. The boy had grown up too fast in the past 2 years, had been forced to shoulder responsibilities that belonged to grown men. "What's the catch, mister? What do you want from us?" There was steel in his voice, a protective instinct that made Martha proud even as it broke her heart. Cain looked down at the boy with something that might have been approval, recognizing the courage it took for a 14-year-old to challenge a grown man who had just spent a fortune. "Smart question, son. I want 7 years of honest work from you and your mother. Nothing more, nothing less. You'll earn your keep, help with the cattle and the land, learn what needs learning. At the end of 7 years, the debt is paid and you're free to go where you please." His words were simple and direct, but Martha heard something else in them, a promise that went beyond the legal requirements of their arrangement. This was not a man who would abuse his position or take advantage of their vulnerability. She had become expert at reading men's intentions over the past 2 years, at recognizing the difference between genuine kindness and predatory interest. Sarah peeked out from behind her mother's skirt, her small face still streaked with tears, but no longer twisted with terror. "Will you hurt us?" she asked in a voice so small it was barely audible. The question seemed to hit Cain like a physical blow. He crouched down so he was at eye level with the little girl, and when he spoke, his voice was gentler than Martha had thought possible. There was something in his expression that suggested he understood exactly why she would ask such a question, that he had seen enough of the world's cruelty to know that not all adults could be trusted. "No, little one. I will never hurt you or your family. You have my word on that." He extended his hand to her, palm up, in a gesture of peace. "My name is Cain. What's yours?" Sarah looked up at her mother for permission, then back at Cain. "Sarah Elizabeth Henley," she said with the formal precision that children use when introducing themselves to important adults. "It's nice to meet you." "Sarah Elizabeth Henley," Cain said solemnly. "I think you're going to like my ranch. There are horses there and a creek where you can catch fish, and mountains that touch the clouds." Something in his tone, in the steady certainty of his promise, made Martha believe him. She had become expert at reading men's intentions over the past 2 years, at recognizing the difference between genuine kindness and predatory interest. This man, this stranger who had just spent a fortune to save them from a fate worse than death, wanted nothing from her that she wasn't willing to give. The crowd began to disperse as Cain helped Martha and her children down from the platform. Morganton stalked away, cursing under his breath, his plans for Martha thoroughly ruined. Polk lingered long enough to spit in their direction before mounting his horse and riding out of town with a black scowl on his face. But most of the townspeople simply drifted away, returning to their normal lives as if they hadn't just witnessed a human family being sold like livestock. Sheriff Coleman approached as they gathered the few possessions Martha had been allowed to bring. Everything they owned in the world fit into 2 small bundles in a battered carpet bag. "Cain," the sheriff said quietly, his voice heavy with gratitude and relief. "That was a decent thing you did here today." "More than decent." Cain nodded but didn't reply. His attention focused on loading Martha's meager belongings into a sturdy wagon that looked like it could carry them to the ends of the earth, if necessary. The wagon was well built and well maintained, like everything else about Cain Morrison. The children climbed into the back, still uncertain but no longer terrified, while Martha took the seat beside Cain with as much dignity as she could muster. As they rolled out of Redemption Falls, Martha finally found her voice. The town fell away behind them, becoming smaller and less significant with each turn of the wagon wheels. Why, she asked, the question that had been burning in her heart since the moment he had spoken his impossible bid. Why did you do this for us? You don't even know us. Cain was quiet for so long that she thought he might not answer. The wagon wheels creaked rhythmically as they followed the winding road that led up into the mountains, leaving the town and its ugly memories behind. The air grew cleaner with each mile, and Martha found herself breathing more deeply than she had in months. Finally, he spoke without taking his eyes off the trail ahead. I know what it's like to lose everything, he said, his voice so quiet she had to strain to hear it over the sound of the wheels and the horses' hooves. To have the people you love taken away by circumstances beyond your control. I know what it's like to stand on that platform. Even if it wasn't the same kind of platform. Martha waited, sensing there was more, but Cain fell silent again. The mountains grew larger around them as they climbed, and the air grew cleaner with each mile they put between themselves and town. The children had stopped crying and were pointing excitedly at eagles soaring overhead, at wildflowers blooming in impossible profusion along the roadside. Michael was asking Thomas about the different kinds of trees they were passing, while Sarah had fallen asleep against a bundle of blankets, exhausted by the emotional trauma of the morning. It was nearly sunset when they reached Cain's ranch, and Martha's breath caught in her throat at the sight of it. She had expected something rough and primitive, a bachelor's crude shelter in the wilderness. Instead, she found a beautiful log house nestled in a natural clearing, with barns and corrals that spoke of careful planning and skilled craftsmanship. A creek ran through the property, its water sparkling in the golden light, and the pastures beyond were dotted with healthy cattle. This was not the home of a hermit or a miser, but of a man who had built something lasting and beautiful in the wilderness. Cain helped them down from the wagon and led them inside. The house was simply furnished but spotlessly clean, with a massive stone fireplace and windows that looked out on vistas that belonged in fairy tales. The main room was large and comfortable, with handmade furniture that showed both skill and care in its construction. He showed them to rooms that had clearly been prepared in advance, as if he had been planning this moment for longer than just one afternoon. Martha's room was at the back of the house, with windows that looked out over the creek and the meadow beyond. It was larger than any room she had ever called her own, with a comfortable bed and a wardrobe that stood empty and waiting. The children's rooms were smaller but equally well appointed, and Thomas in particular seemed amazed to have a space that was entirely his own. That first evening, as they sat around Cain's table eating a simple but satisfying dinner of beef stew and fresh bread, Martha began to understand something about the man who had saved her family. Cain Morrison was indeed a man of few words, but his actions spoke volumes about his character. He treated her children with patience and kindness, listening to their questions and concerns with genuine attention. He had obviously put thought into their arrival, had prepared their rooms and stocked the pantry with foods that children would enjoy. Over the following weeks, Martha began to understand the man who had saved her family on an even deeper level. Cain was a rancher in the truest sense, working his land with a dedication that bordered on reverence. He rose before dawn and worked until well after dark, but he always made time for the children. He taught Thomas how to work with the cattle, showing him the difference between a good cow and a great one, how to read the signs that indicated illness or injury in the herd. Michael proved to have a natural talent for tracking and hunting, skills that Cain encouraged with patience and wisdom. Sarah, perhaps because she was young enough to accept miracles without question, simply decided that Cain Morrison was the father she had lost and proceeded to wrap him around her tiny finger with ruthless efficiency. Martha watched in amazement as this silent, wounded man gradually opened his heart to a 6-year-old girl who asked him to read bedtime stories and demanded piggyback rides to see the baby calves. But Cain was also, Martha gradually realized, a man haunted by his own ghosts. Sometimes she would catch him staring off toward the eastern horizon with an expression of such profound loss that it made her heart ache. There were rooms in the house that he never entered, dust covers over furniture that suggested a life once shared but now solitary. A woman's belongings packed away in trunks, a child's toys stored in a barn loft where they wouldn't be a daily reminder of what had been lost. The story came out in pieces, like fragments of a shattered photograph slowly being put back together. Cain had been married once, to a woman named Alina who had loved this harsh and beautiful land as much as he did. They had met in Santa Fe, where she had been working as a school teacher, and he had been selling cattle. Their courtship had been brief but intense, and they had married within 6 months of meeting. Elena had followed him to this remote valley, had helped him build the ranch with her own hands. They had been happy here, deliriously so. Elena had been everything Cain was not: talkative, social, filled with laughter and dreams for their future. She had planned to start a school for the few children in the valley, had talked about filling their house with children and laughter. They had built the ranch together, had planned to grow old watching their children and grandchildren play in the meadows that surrounded their home. But fever had taken Elena in their 3rd year of marriage, a swift and merciless illness that had claimed her life in a matter of days. Cain had been helpless to save her, had watched the light fade from her eyes while he held her hand and whispered promises he could never keep. The doctor had come too late, the nearest town too far away, the medicine too primitive to combat the disease that had invaded her body. And then, as if fate had not been cruel enough, the Comanche had come in the spring of 1864. They had taken Elena's grave marker as a trophy, had burned the small cabin where Cain and Alina had spent their 1st year of marriage, and in the chaos of the raid, they had taken something even more precious. Their infant daughter, barely 6 months old, had vanished in the smoke and confusion of the attack. Cain had searched the aftermath frantically, had found no trace of little Anna Alina Morrison. He had spent 2 years hunting the war party that had destroyed his family, tracking them across 3 territories with single-minded determination. When he finally found them, when he had taken his revenge and left their bones bleaching in the desert sun, he had returned to the ranch hollow and broken. The victory had been empty, the revenge meaningless in the face of what he had lost. For 5 years he had lived like a ghost in his own home, going through the motions of life but never truly living. Martha learned to read the signs of his moods, the subtle changes in expression that meant he was remembering something painful. She learned to give him space when the ghosts grew too heavy, and to be present when he was ready to rejoin the world of the living. The children, with their natural resilience, adapted more quickly than she had dared hope. Thomas threw himself into ranch work with an enthusiasm that earned Cain's obvious approval, while Michael discovered a talent for tracking and hunting that impressed even the most experienced hands Cain hired for roundup season. The first winter was hard, but they weathered it together. The snow came early and stayed late, and there were nights when the wind howled through the valley like a living thing bent on destruction. But the house was solid and warm, the stores of food adequate, and the work of caring for the cattle gave them all purpose and direction. Cain taught them all the skills they would need to survive in this harsh country, from reading weather signs to preserving meat to finding shelter in sudden blizzards. Martha proved surprisingly adept at managing the ranch's books and correspondence, skills she had learned during Jacob's illness that now served her well in this new life. She had always been good with numbers, and the challenge of balancing accounts and planning for seasonal expenses gave her a sense of purpose she had not felt since Jacob's death. Cain seemed grateful for her help and gradually began to rely on her judgment in matters of ranch management. Spring brought its own challenges and revelations. The cattle had survived the winter well, and the spring roundup promised to be profitable. New calves frolicked in the meadows, and the creek ran high with snowmelt from the mountains. But it also brought visitors to the ranch. Men from town who had heard rumors about Cain's unusual household and wanted to see for themselves what was happening in the high country. Silas Morganton arrived on a warm April morning, ostensibly to discuss buying some of Cain's cattle, but really to get a closer look at Martha. He made comments about how well she looked, how the mountain air seemed to agree with her, how fortunate she was to have found such comfortable circumstances. His eyes lingered on her in ways that made her skin crawl, and his suggestions about her gratitude toward Cain were barely veiled insults that made her blood boil with indignation. Cain listened to it all without expression, but Martha could see the tension building in his shoulders, the way his hands gradually formed fists at his sides. When Morganton finally made the mistake of suggesting that Martha might be earning her keep, in ways beyond housework and bookkeeping, Cain's response was swift and final. The saloon owner found himself lifted bodily from his chair and deposited on the front porch with enough force to rattle his teeth. Cain's voice, when he spoke, was quieter than a whisper but carried more menace than any shout could have conveyed. "You'll leave my land now, Morganton. And you'll remember that Martha Henley is under my protection, along with her children. Anyone who fails to show her proper respect will answer to me personally." Morganton left without another word, but Martha knew the incident would be all over town within days. She also knew that Cain had just publicly claimed her family as his own, had drawn a line in the dust that would keep the predators at bay, but might also trap them all in expectations neither of them was ready to meet. That evening, as the children played near the creek and the sun painted the mountains gold and purple, Martha found the courage to ask the question that had been burning in her heart for months. The air was soft and warm, filled with the scent of wildflowers and the sound of running water. It was the kind of evening that made promises seem possible and dreams seem within reach. "Cain," she said quietly, not looking at him as they sat on the porch watching the day fade into night. "What happens at the end of 7 years?" He was silent for so long that she thought he might not answer. The minutes stretched between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. Finally, he turned to look at her, and in his eyes she saw not the winter storms she had grown accustomed to, but something warmer and more complex. "That depends," he said carefully, his voice rough with emotions he had kept buried for too long. "On what you want to happen." Martha felt her heart racing, but she forced herself to meet his gaze. The truth was something she had been avoiding for months, something that frightened her almost as much as it thrilled her. "I want to stay, we all do. This is home now more than any place has ever been. But I need to know, are we family, Cain? Or are we just employees who happen to live in the same house?" Cain reached over and took her hand, his calloused fingers gentle against her palm. His touch was warm and sure, and Martha felt something inside her chest loosen and expand. "I've been asking myself that same question for months now," he admitted. "I never planned on caring about anyone again, never thought I had it in me. But watching you with your children, seeing Thomas grow into a man, listening to Sarah's laughter fill this house again, it's brought something back to life in me that I thought was gone forever." He paused, struggling with words that had been too long unspoken. "I can't replace Jacob, Martha, I wouldn't try. But if you'll have me, if your children can accept me, I'd like to be more than just the man who paid your debt. I'd like to be the man who chooses to build a life with you." Martha felt tears streaming down her face, but for the first time in years, they were tears of joy rather than sorrow. "Jacob would approve," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "Hay always said that love wasn't about possession, but about protection. About choosing to care for someone every single day even when it's hard." Cain nodded, understanding flooding his features. "Then maybe we can choose each other, not because of debt or obligation, but because this broken world makes more sense when we face it together." The children, as if sensing the importance of the moment, came running up from the creek with muddy feet and bright smiles. Sarah launched herself into Cain's lap without hesitation, while Thomas and Michael flanked Martha's chair like young guardians. In that moment, sitting on the porch of a house built from love and loss, watching the stars emerge over mountains that had sheltered them all, Martha Henley Morrison knew that some debts could never be calculated in dollars and cents. Some debts could only be paid in love, in loyalty, in the daily choice to stand together against whatever storms might come. And as Cain's arms tightened around her daughter, as her sons leaned against her chair, as the man who had saved them all looked out over the land that had become their sanctuary, Martha understood that the account had finally been settled in full. The 7 years passed like seasons, each one bringing its own challenges and joys. There were harsh winters that tested their resolve, spring floods that threatened the cattle, and summer droughts that made every blade of grass precious. There were also moments of perfect happiness: Thomas's wedding to the daughter of a neighboring rancher, Michael's acceptance to the territorial college where he planned to study law, Sarah's first dance at the church social in town where she charmed every young man present. Through it all, Cain and Martha built something stronger than either of them had imagined possible. Not a replacement for what they had lost, but something new and precious in its own right. A family forged not by blood or law, but by choice and commitment and the daily miracle of love freely given. They faced each challenge together, weathered each storm as a unit, and celebrated each victory as a shared triumph. When the 7 years were officially over, Cain ceremonially burned the debt papers in the fireplace while the whole family watched. The flames consumed the legal documents that had bound them together, but by then, the gesture was purely symbolic. The real debt had been paid long ago, in ways that no ledger book could record and no auctioneer's gavel could sell. Martha Morrison stood in her kitchen, watching her husband teach their grandchildren to rope calves in the corral, and marveled at the strange mathematics of grace. She had lost everything once, had stood on a platform as her family was sold like livestock to pay what others claimed she owed. But in losing everything, she had found something infinitely more valuable, the knowledge that some things in this world cannot be bought or sold, only chosen and cherished and protected with everything you have. Years later, when travelers would stop at the Morrison Ranch and ask about the woman who had once been sold at auction in Redemption Falls, Cain would simply tip his hat and say that some stories weren't meant for telling. But Martha would smile and invite them to stay for supper. And over plates of venison and fresh bread, they would see the truth written in the laughter of children and grandchildren, in the way a silent man's eyes lit up when his wife entered the room, in the photographs on the mantel that showed a family built not from blood alone, but from choice and courage and the unshack